The first thing I like to do in outlining a tray for the mandibular arch is to remember the depth from the crest of the alveolar ridge to the lingual frenum. And you might remember in our patient, with this particular patient, there is a ledge of bone starting about the first premolar area on one side, coming across the midline, and about the first premolar area on the other side. Now, we don't want our tray to go down over that ledge of bone. We want it to stay just short of that. So our tray basically is only going to come to right here through that sublingual crescent area. We want to remember the mylohyoid ridge, and on the mylohyoid ridge on this particular patient, it starts right about there and it comes forward about like so. It's the mylohyoid ridge. On the other side, we have the mylohyoid ridge is starting right here and it comes forward. That's the mylohyoid ridge. Now what we're going to do is we're going to outline our tray so that it starts at the depth in the midline around here, and it's going to stay above the mylohyoid ridge until you get to the area of about the first molar. It's going to remain almost in the same plane as you started out, fairly well paralleling the horizontal portion of the crest of the ridge. And that tray now is going to come along and cross the mylohyoid ridge in about the first molar area. Okay, to about the first molar region. Then it's going to cross the mylohyoid ridge in the area of the first molar and continue on back into infinity. Let's do the same thing on the other side now. It's going to follow the crest of the ridge in one plane, cross the mylohyoid ridge in the area of the first molar and continue into infinity. Next thing that you want to realize is the retromolar pad. And we're going to start the design of the distal end of the tray, distal lingual of it, by first identifying the retromolar pad, which would be here. And the same on the other side, the retromolar pad here. Now what you want to do is to drop a vertical from the distal of the retromolar pad and let it gently round into this line that we had as a plane for the lingual flange here. So we let these just gently round into each other, and that's our form now for the lingual flange. The same thing on the other side. Drop the vertical from the distal of the retromolar pad and just let it gently round into it in such a manner. That will create for you now a tray that's going to extend in this area into an area on each side that is known as the retromylohyoid fossa area. And it's important that our tray extend to the proper depth into that retromylohyoid fossa area. Now let's look at the facial surfaces of it. We want to remember that first of all we want to identify the external oblique line, which is coming right here. On each side we can see the external oblique line right about there. We want to remember that at the distal buccal, in other words just lateral to the retromolar pad on each side and outside of the external oblique line, you're going to have a large muscle laying right in this area like so. That muscle is the masseter muscle. So we want to allow our tray to come off of the distal of the retromolar pad at an oblique direction out to meet the external oblique line right in this area. And that's about the extent that you would want your tray. You can do the same on the other side now, from the distal of the retromolar pad obliquely out to the external oblique line. Now, next thing we want to look for is the buccal frenum area. And I can see a faint indication here of the buccal frenum right here, and it comes to about that height right there. So our external oblique line is coming down here now. We're going to allow our tray to come along on the external oblique line until that external oblique line sort of disappears on us and you can't find it anymore. Then the tray is just going to gently sweep up into a notch for the buccal frenum that we find right here. Then it's going to come back down just enough to go to the depth of the fold of the mucolabial fold. Right here's a better indication now of a buccal frenum coming up. And here's how far we want that tray to come up to allow for a notch for the buccal frenum. It'll be right at that height. Then after the notch, we can drop it back down and follow the mucolabial fold around to meet the other side. That is the outline, basically, of what we want our tray to look like. The next thing that we want to worry about in forming relief wax for the mandibular arch is the area of the mylohyoid muscle and the mylohyoid line. In other words, this area right here where we're going to have the tray extending beyond the mylohyoid line. In those areas, what I generally like to do is to over-relieve the cast by placing an extra 1 or 2 thicknesses of base plate wax from the crest of the ridge lingually in this area to over-relieve the cast. And we do the same thing on the other side from this area, the distal of the mylohyoid line, which is usually about the mesial of the retromolar pad, to just anterior to where our tray is going to be crossing the mylohyoid line. And we're going to place an extra layer of wax here, an extra layer of wax here, and then we're going to put relief wax over the entire cast after we place that extra relief for the mylohyoid area. So we're going to start the application of the relief wax then by cutting some little squares of wax. Now that was neat, wasn't it? To fit this area and this area and get those adapted first. We just heat some wax up in the flame again for that. And generally it's about 1 inch of width for there. And I'll cut about 1 inch of wax off of that and just lay that wax right over the area where we want to adapt it, like so, and cut it off at the crest of the ridge, about like so. We're going to do the same on the other side. That gives us 1 extra layer of base plate wax now of relief in the area of the mylohyoid line. The object is going to be to adapt 1 layer of base plate wax over everything else that we see on that lower. And we're going to do that just like we did on the maxillary. So we'll use a wedge of wax about like so, a piece of wax to start this. Soften the wax in the flame and adapt it generally to, I usually start on the lingual with it and adapt it well down into the mucolingual fold area and over the crest of the ridge and adapt it well to the cast. And take a knife, get rid of the excess. We can do the same on the lingual, we're getting rid of the excess. Just take a knife and cut it off of there. And again, like we did on the maxillary, I usually just cut that to the depth of the fold at this point. Then after the tray is made, we can cut the wax back to, or cut the tray back to the actual length that we would want the peripheries to go. And we need a wedge of wax now to put relief over the opposite side. So we heat some wax in the flame again. Cut a piece of wax and adapt it to the cast, soften it real well, adapt it to the cast just like we did on the opposite side. Again, we'll start this on the lingual and adapt it well into the mucolingual fold and adapt it well to the cast like so. Then we take a knife, cut the excess off again. Cut the lingual off. We get rid of this out in the front where it overlapped. And cut the lingual off. Get rid of the excess off of it now. Now once we have the wax adapted like this, if you need to, you can take a warm spatula and smooth out any seams of the wax. If we're going to leave a stop in this tray, as a stop for the tray, we will want that stop to be directly over the buccal shelf. If you cut it into the wax and cut your stop into the wax and build it into your tray as you go, make sure that you cut enough of that off to provide a good wide stop. The problem I find with people cutting the stops into the wax is they make it too small, and that's worse than no stop at all. So let's go ahead and put a stop into it, and when you put a stop into it, you make it cover all of that buccal shelf area, which means everything mesial to the retromolar pad and all the way up to the buccal notch where the buccal frenum would be, and from the crest of the ridge out. And we can get rid of the wax off of that. Well, I think we can get rid of the wax off of that. Yes. Okay, now we've uncovered the entire buccal shelf area, and we can use that as a stop. Do the same on the other side. If you're going to do it, cut them as stops. Just cut it from the crest of the ridge out, all the way out, but make sure that you've got it wide enough and large enough to create a good stop rather than just a real tiny little area, as I'll see some of them. So if we've provided stops in it, we're ready to adapt the tinfoil now. And again, we're going to, it takes usually a little bit more tinfoil to do the lower than it did for the maxillary, so I'll cut just a little bit more off of it. And now let's take about a piece about like so for our first adaptation of the tinfoil, and we'll lay it onto the cast on one side and rub it in with the finger till it's adapted in very nice and smooth, as smooth as we can get it, and over the cast all the way down, including all the way out to the periphery. And I usually bend the edges, any excess you have down over the edges, and that helps hold it in place. And if you smooth it real well, that'll make a very nice separator for your tray material, so that your tray material doesn't stick to the cast, number one, and number two, it doesn't allow the wax to melt and ruin the surface of the tray. So that adapted fairly well just with finger pressure without having to do much else with it. And if you want to find a few little wrinkles in it, then perhaps a good thing to use for that would be a pencil eraser. So we'll cut a piece now and adapt it to the other side. And again, just adapt it in as best you possibly can. Let the excess come down over the cast, over the vertical walls of the cast. That'll help hold it in place. And you'll have some overlap of it, but that's fine. The overlap doesn't bother you. Just adapt it in very nice and smooth onto the cast like so. And if you got wrinkles again, use an eraser. We'll use a wooden handle of a knife. You could use a tongue blade or a cotton roll. All of those things will work as a burnishing agent for the tinfoil. Just make sure it is well adapted. Now we have all of our tinfoil burnished in fairly well, so that it is about as smooth as you're going to get it. Very convenient in working with a mandibular cast to cut the material right down the middle from about halfway back through the posterior part of it. This allows us to adapt the material much easier when we lay it onto the cast. And we'll bring it far enough forward now to cover the labial portion to make sure it's covered properly. And if we end up with some void, it'll be back in the posterior region, and we're going to be a little bit void there and a little bit void there. But we can use the excess material to adapt that. So we adapt the material onto the cast. Just as we did on the maxillary. And now we can cut the excess off. Cut the excess from the lingual. can utilize some extra material that we might have left over and adapt it into the void areas, such as we have here on the lingual. And all we need to do is just to push it and mold the material together with it in that area. And a little bit on this posterior, just to make sure we have everything covered. And now I'm going to gather all of the excess material that is remaining, and we're going to mold that material into a long, narrow strip. For the mandibular arch, the handle is going to be quite different than what it is on the maxillary arch. The handle is actually going to extend from about 2/3 of the way back the ridge on either side posteriorly all around the labial area to about 2/3 of the way around to the other side. And we do that by just taking the excess material, mold it into a nice little rope of material about so long, and now we're just going to adapt that. And that handle now should be on the mandibular one posteriorly directly over the crest of the ridge. Anteriorly it can be a little bit labial to the crest of the ridge, but certainly not much. Now I've got that a little bit too far around to one side, so I need to go back with this now, and we'll start at the midline with it. It can be a little labial to the crest of the ridge on the labial portions and the anterior portion, but posteriorly we want it over the crest of the ridge. We adapt it in very, very well so that it adheres to the original material. And now we're going to shape that handle in two ways. In the anterior portion, I want to build that up enough to when I get a hold of it like that, I can hold that without it slipping out of my fingers. Posteriorly, what we want to do with that, we would like to keep the surface of this parallel to the crest of the ridge if at all possible. It looks a little low posteriorly, so we just build that up a little bit by squeezing it like that. And I like to have that posterior part of this handle that's built up back there come to a knife edge at the top of it. The reason for that we will discuss a little bit as we're making final impressions. This really basically, by building it up to a knife edge posteriorly, allows us to gauge how much pressure we're applying as we make a final impression. For the mandibular tray, we do exactly the same thing. After it has been formed, we paint it with the air barrier. Just put a light coat of the air barrier over all the surfaces, external surfaces of the tray. And then we place it into the oven. This time I want to lower it back down now until we're getting a maximum concentration onto the tray from the light, and allow that to cure for 4 minutes. From the unit, take the tray off of the cast. Remove everything from the inside of the tray, any wax that we have, and tinfoil from the inside of the tray. And now we paint the internal surface of the tray with the air barrier. Once that has been painted, we put it back into the unit once again. Start the unit for 4 minutes. And we're going to do the same now with the mandibular tray. And we'll go back to the larger burr to do the gross trimming. Now that the trays have been trimmed to the original guesstimation of what the peripheral length should be, we're ready to take these trays to the patient and do the procedures of border molding and making master impressions.